Okay, we are 1 minute past the top of the hour, so we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Natalie Mims-Frick, and today we're going to share information from our recent report that's titled Moving Beyond Direct Load Control, a Maturity Model for Realizing the Promise of Demand Flexibility. We go on to the next slide, please. Our agenda for today is shown here. And after I go through some housekeeping, I'll hand the presentation over to Josh Schellenberg. He's going to provide some background on the project, and then we'll describe a maturity model that can be adapted and used to prioritize investment, identify gaps, and drive continuous improvement to realize state demand flexibility goals. Josh will walk through the maturity model categories and capabilities, discuss considerations for adapting the demand flexibility maturity model, and close with some example applications. We'll have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. If you have questions at any point in time, you can put them into the Q&A box. We can go on to the next slide, please. Just some general housekeeping. All of you are muted. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box. Our webinar is being recorded. When the slides, after the presentation, we will post the slides at the same place that the report is located, which is at this link right here. And I will also distribute the link to the recording in a couple of days after we have it processed to everybody who's registered for the webinar. So that was all that I have. I'm going to, excuse me, turn it over to Josh Schellenberg, who has over 15 years of experience designing and evaluating demand flexibility programs, rates, and pilots, including California's third-party demand response auction mechanism. As a Berkeley Lab affiliate, he provides technical assistance to states in the areas of demand flexibility, grid resilience, and transmission planning. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you, Natalie. And yeah, we can certainly take some questions along the way, but let's dive in, and we'll leave some time at the end as well for questions. So let's take a look at the current state of demand flexibility. And with respect to that, it's really important to understand how we're talking about these things these days as an industry, because there is a bit of confusion at times. Obviously, demand response, or DR, has been around for quite a while. And we view demand flexibility as kind of the next step beyond demand response. So it's still just focusing on the customer side of the meter and how they're adjusting their demand with the help of on-site distributed energy resources. But it's offering a broader range of grid services like reducing, shedding, shifting, modulating, or generating electricity behind the meter. And then you might also see a lot about virtual power plants in the media or industry press. And that is something that does encompass demand flexibility as well, but that's where you start to go beyond. You go to the front of the meter and have a broader range of distributed energy resources that might be part of a virtual power plant. So what we're focusing on here is demand flexibility, which is behind the meter, providing a broader range of grid services than just reducing load, which is typically associated with demand response. And as we think about the state of demand flexibility, we really need to also look back at how advanced meters have penetrated the US market. In 2007, advanced meters had about 5% penetration, and that number has grown to 72% in 2022. So now there's over 119 million advanced meters nationwide. And this is, in many ways, was meant to enable this broader range of grid services that DERs can provide as part of a demand flexibility program, because you're able to use those advanced meters to have more dynamic rates and ways of evaluating and assessing the performance of demand flexibility programs. So prior to this growth in advanced meters, though, FERC estimated in 2006 that the total potential resource contribution from all existing DR programs and rates nationwide was about 37.5 gigawatts. And at the time, there was a lot of interest in demand response programs. It was growing interest. Results from recent pilots were encouraging. And this was based on a survey that they did across a wide range of states. So with all of that interest back in 2006 and this expansion of advanced meters as an enabling technology for demand flexibility, let's take a look at where things stand now. And, unfortunately, DR programs have not grown substantially, even though the potential has increased with the adoption of advanced meters and connected devices, which could include everything from a smart thermostat to an electric vehicle. Yet, despite all of that, the latest data from EIA shows that retail DR program capacity is at about 31 gigawatts. And that's basically the same as it was 10 years ago, as you can see in this graph at the top right. At the bottom right here, it shows the most, or from 2018 to 2022 by census division. And in that graph as well, over the course of the 5 years that it shows there, there's no evidence of consistent multi-year growth in potential peak demand savings. And just to clarify what that metric means in particular and how EIA has been measuring this over the years, it's looking at what is the potential demand reduction that these DR programs can deliver if they're all called, if all customers are called at the same time on peak. So it's not looking at actual like ex post estimates. It's the survey of the utility captures what they think their overall capacity of the program would be if it was called to 100% participation on a peak day. And so based on that metric, it just hasn't really been much growth, unfortunately. And then my colleague, Sean Murphy, and others at Berkeley Lab also did an in-depth review of 148 programs around the country and found that most demand flexibility efforts focus on reducing demand during summer peaks, driven by air conditioning. So there's this broader issue in the industry of the potential for demand flexibility and demand response as a subset growing substantially, but we haven't been able to realize the promise of that potential to this point. So that's why we have put together the demand flexibility maturity model. And so let's jump into an overview here. And this really comes from what we've found in supporting states with technical assistance and reviewing what has happened in states throughout the country with demand flexibility programs, is that states and utilities are seeking novel approaches for driving demand flexibility progress. And, especially with surging load from data centers, manufacturing facilities that are increasingly being brought back to this country in some cases, buildings and transportation electrification. This is really increasing the need for a wide range of resources, and demand flexibility is especially well positioned to mitigate capacity constraints. And so there's more of an urgency to realize the promise of the potential of demand flexibility. And, as noted, states and utilities are seeking novel approaches to do that. So this maturity model that we developed is based on well-documented industry best practices for utility-administered demand flexibility programs. And as you could see, with the figure on the left, this is the overview of the demand flexibility maturity model, and it's broken down into 6 categories that I'll be summarizing today. This is not a completely new concept in the utilities industry. There have been other maturity models that have been applied to utility capabilities, most notably for wildfire mitigation in California, and that's something that's actually integrated into the regulatory process. But then also there are tools made available to utilities with respect to cybersecurity and smart grid maturity models that utilities can self-administer. And what we're envisioning for this maturity model is that can be used in both cases, states may choose to integrate it into a regulatory process to measure progress and drive best practices. But utilities, including municipal utilities or cooperatives, can use the maturity model to do a self-assessment and develop a roadmap for their demand flexibility programs. At a high level, the maturity model drives demand flexibility programs in the following directions. So on the left here, you see what is characterized as a low maturity. And then on the right, you can see what is meant by a high maturity. And I'm not going to go into detail on all of these, but effectively, what we see a lot today around the country, and as the work by Sean Murphy and others has shown, is that the programs that are out there now are predominantly lower maturity programs that are not as flexible as you might expect, given all of the increase in potential. In many cases, there's a limited understanding of performance. It's really just focused on those peak periods. And enrollment is emphasized as the primary success metric in many cases. When we look at the higher level of maturity, which is what a lot of states and utilities want to get to, that's where we start to have highly flexible programs that are driven by grid needs and accurate granular data. So that's a key one there. But also just having ongoing performance assessment, proactive testing and monitoring of key leading indicators, and really understanding the customer specific expected value that a customer can deliver, as well as the DERs that they have on site, as opposed to just focusing on enrollment as a success metric. And then, driving value at scale. That's really what we want to get to. That's why part of the reason why we called this webinar Time to Grow Up, because given the surging load, it's really important to drive scale, value at scale for demand flexibility programs. Here's a deeper dive into each of the 6 categories. And so each of them has 5 to 7 capabilities, and states and utilities can use the maturity assessment for each of those capabilities to prioritize investment, identify gaps, and drive continuous improvement. Each capability is scored at one of 5 levels of maturity. So level 1 is below expectations. Level 2 is meets minimum expectations. Level 3 is beyond minimum expectations, but not quite at level 4, which is consistent with best practice. And level 5 is improvement over best practice. And so what this does is it takes all of the industry literature that's out there and conference presentations, reviewer feedback that we've received, personal experience that Natalie and I have had over the years with assessing demand response and demand flexibility programs. And it really just breaks it down for each of these 34 categories and lays out what is a low level maturity, and then as you move up, how can you improve? And now I'm going to take a little bit of a detour into third-party demand flexibility, because this is also something that many states have pursued and many utilities have pursued, because third parties can help drive value at scale, whether it's a DER aggregator or a device company that makes a smart thermostat, or an electric vehicle company. Those players can really help drive value at scale, and it's been a major thing that states have pursued. In particular, California. And so I'm going to lay out here just briefly some of the challenges, though, with the demand response auction mechanism, or DRAM, in California, and talk about how we've applied key learnings from DRAM to the demand flexibility maturity model. So in 2015, DRAM begins with the promise that for the first time, aggregations of customer-cited resources of at least 100 kW will have access to the state's electricity markets. However, this process worked, through the utilities who effectively administered the auctions and procured the resources, and then oversaw the process in which those resources were bid into the market. However, it took many years to have the first independent evaluation report, and I was actually the principal author of that report and evaluation. And ultimately, it basically found that the uh, auction mechanism was not performing well. The third-party resources were not performing well, particularly uh, there was a lack of availability during critical hours. So in August 2020, California had its first rolling blackouts since the California energy crisis. So it was about almost 20 years since there were rolling blackouts. Thankfully, it was a fairly localized event, but it found through the evaluation that DRAM was simply not available in those critical hours. And so that was a major issue. But perhaps more importantly, although third parties can help scale and drive efficiency, there was a huge amount of administrative burden, data errors, and reporting inconsistencies. And that really led to a wide range of issues, including overcompensation and a lack of confidence and transparency, and ultimately, lack of ability to scale efficiently. And so in 2024, after over $100 million were allocated to the statewide procurement budget, the CPUC decides to close the program, and that was based in part on the evaluation report's findings. And so there's a lot of really great learnings out of this, and we applied it to the maturity model. So there's a significant emphasis on close monitoring of performance and availability during critical hours. And what that ultimately is meant to do is ensure that avoided costs are tied to demonstrably offsetting grid investments. I'm sure many of you have done some sort of benefit cost analysis or TRC test for demand flexibility or energy efficiency programs. And a huge component of that is the avoided cost. By investing in a demand response or demand flexibility program, you're able to avoid another type of investment. But if the program is not demonstrably offsetting those grid investments, if you have to end up making those grid investments anyways, then that really hurts the value of the program that it was set up for in the first place. And so secondly, we've also developed standalone categories for DER orchestration and data infrastructure to highlight the importance of data accuracy and reducing administrative burden for all parties involved. And so this is something that we've really emphasized throughout the maturity model and the report. Setting up that infrastructure from the beginning is really important because that's ultimately what's going to allow for efficient scaling of demand flexibility programs, especially with third-party involvement. And then finally, there's a big emphasis on proactive testing and identification of key leading indicators, leading to rapid iteration and perhaps more importantly, failing fast when necessary. Because I think, as you can see by the dates on the left side of this slide, that there was a lot of time to ultimately assess how this mechanism was performing. And if there were some fairly basic key leading indicators, like, is this program available when we need it most? I mean, you don't even need to do a really in-depth evaluation for that. It's a fairly straightforward metric. That could have really allowed the state overall to act more quickly to improve the program. And so that's why having those key leading indicators be proactively identified and tested is a really big emphasis for the maturity model. All right, so let's dive in with an example demand flexibility capability maturity assessment. So what we're going to do in this case is assess the targeting capability within the customer engagement category. And so as you can see here, we have the breakdown of the maturity model with the 6 categories across the top. And the capabilities are below that first row. And so we're going to be looking at the targeting capability as shown by the red box. And so what you'll find when you look at the report, the link is included again here at the bottom of the slide, is one of these pages for each of the capabilities. And so this is basically laying out your category at the top here, the capability, including a definition, the maturity levels, and then each of these columns represents that maturity level. And I'll walk through that right now. So that's the definition for the targeting capability. And for all 34 capabilities, that definition is provided at the top, again, in the appendix of the report. And then each capability is further broken down into maturity indicators. So in the case of targeting, this is looking at what is the basis for the targeting, what are the customer segments, and what is the device adoption component, because that's a huge part of targeting demand flexibility programs. Oftentimes it's tied in with the DERs that a customer may already have or may be very likely to adopt. For level 1 maturity, many of the capabilities will actually have no requirements for level 1, and this is actually something that's fairly common that I've seen in utility plans where there's a program that's laid out and there really isn't much of a targeting strategy laid out at all, or there basically isn't one, and that actually might be more common than you think, because a lot of times utilities want and states want to make the program available to everybody. You can make the program available to everybody, but you still can target it with proactive engagement. And that's something that's been shown to create a significant amount of value and reduce free ridership and just improve the program all overall. So then if a utilities program or a proposed program were to be scored at level 2 maturity for the targeting capability, it must meet all of the indicators that are in this column. Of course, though, this is something that can be adapted and it doesn't have to be taken as is. So if a given state or utility wants to score things differently or subtract one of these categories or move these columns around, that's something that certainly can be done. So just wanted to make sure that was clear. But at level 2 here, the basis for targeting is basically focused on the propensity to enroll. Again, that's where you're just focusing on enrollment as the primary success metric, as opposed to the actual value that the customer may provide in terms of load impacts. And you'll see a lot of programs that have marketing personas based on predefined groups, and those predefined groups don't really focus on outcomes related to demand flexibility program enrollment or usage. And so this is a rudimentary targeting strategy where you might have a few, groups that you look at, low income, might be, as you see with some of these marketing personas, there could be, the elderly married couple versus the young groups of people that are, early adopters, those types of things. But a lot of times those personas don't focus on outcomes. And that's really what we want to get to here as we move up to the higher levels of maturity. So here's a focus on level 3. And as you can see underlined there, in many cases, the maturity model will refer back to the prior level. And so in this case, in terms of the basis for targeting, it looks at propensity to enroll, but then starts to apply screening criteria based on overall usage and customers that are known to have eligible devices. So this is where the program is starting to think about targeting certain groups that overall will have higher value. And then in terms of the customer segments, the maturity level 3 there is similar to level 2, but it starts to incorporate adjustments based on program enrollment and usage. And so it's starting to evolve a little bit there, but for the most part, it's similar to level 2 when it comes to this row here. And then as you'll see here at levels 4 and 5, these can be a high bar. And that's something some reviewers have commented on, saying, well, it seems like there's a big jump between level 3 and 4. And that's by design, because we want the level 4 consistent with best practice, or especially level 5 improvement over best practice to be a stretch goal. And so you can see here that there's a lot more, kind of requirements added to each of these levels. It starts to include incorporating device adoption, likelihood. So the analysis and everything that goes into the targeting is starting to become more complex, starting to integrate third-party data. And so as you can see here, the maturity model, especially at the higher level, starts to get much more specific. And these are, again, based on best practices that have been well documented. And so through the review process and all of the conference presentations and other things that we reviewed as part of this project, we're confident that these are accurate characterizations of best practice and then what could be done to improve over best practice, and trying to make it all easily accessible through this report and the maturity model. So let's take a look at some considerations for adapting the maturity model. And again, we should have a good amount of time for questions at the end, and we can revisit any slides that you'd like. So feel free to include questions now, and we can go back to them later on in the presentation. And so this maturity model is meant for states and utilities to adapt as needed. And so in particular, because there's a wide range of market structures throughout the country, there's vertically integrated utilities, there's restructured markets, markets with competitive retailers. So we try to make sure that these maturity levels are generalized, and we're trying to limit the use of terms that are specific to certain jurisdictions or certain technologies. And so one example of that is just the term device makers. It could include everything from a smart thermostat to an electric vehicle. So we don't want to say, vehicle makers or DER technology providers, because those could start to get a little too specific. This is taking a bit more of a broader term with device makers. And then, another example is DER orchestration platform. There's a lot of debate about there of what a DERMS is, whether it should be called a grid DERMS or an edge DERMS. And so we decided, based on some feedback from utilities, that what really matters in the end is how all of the DERs are orchestrated. And that's why we use the term DER orchestration platform as opposed to a specific term like DERMS or edge DERMS or grid DERMS. But for your utility or just jurisdiction, there might be a DERMS solution that provides all of the DER orchestration that you might need to achieve a certain level of maturity. Secondly, the maturity model is not necessarily a progression, with a higher level clearly being more appropriate than a lower level for every jurisdiction. States and utilities can skip levels or stay at current maturity if that is what is cost effective based on grid needs and other factors, right? So, and also it could be cost effective to have a mix of maturity levels but within a demand flexibility portfolio. So a utility could have a legacy air conditioning direct load control program that focuses on load shedding. And especially with surging load growth, there's going to be more of a need and more value associated with just your old-fashioned load shedding. And if a utility already has a legacy AC load control program in place, it could be delivering a lot of value in that scenario. But then the utility may pursue other types of programs like a behind-the-meter battery storage aggregation that deliver a wider range of grid services in combination with the lower maturity AC cycling type program. So that's important to consider as well, of how the maturity model can be applied to programs separately to put together a portfolio that achieves the objectives that a certain state or utility is going for. And so the remainder of this section summarizes the 6 maturity model categories, including how each jurisdiction can apply and adapt the model to their region. So I'll show one example of that here, and then the report provides even more detail, and there's other slides for each category, but I'm not going to go into detail on that today. But as you can see here, for category 1 out of 6, that is planning and design. Here's the overview and considerations for adapting that category and all of the underlying capabilities to a given state or utility. And so the focus of the planning and design category is on creating programs that are operationally effective, economically justified, and adaptable over time. And this includes involvement of third-party DER aggregators and device makers. And so the goal for higher levels of maturity within this category are making sure that the programs are well positioned to support grid needs, strategic goals, and regulatory requirements. And as I mentioned before, planning and designing cost-effective demand flexibility resources that demonstrably offset other types of grid investments. And so as you're going through that planning process, and valuation is one of the capabilities within planning and design, really ensuring that those avoided cost estimates that are integrated into that benefit cost analysis, or TRC test, are demonstrably proven out later on in the process as a program is launched, and having those key leading indicators tied to those initial assumptions in the planning process. And then finally, this slide shows at the bottom considerations for adapting this category to your state or utility. So in this case, key considerations would include what your projected grid needs are. In some areas, you could just have a significant need for shedding on peak, or there could be significant needs for more flexibility in your program. So that's a key consideration. You'll also want to consider the expected role of third parties, whether your state wants to go big on third parties or have it be more utility driven. That's a decision, each state makes differently. And then also the state objectives, priorities, and particular valuation frameworks that a state may use. So you can take the maturity model and adapt it as needed based on those considerations. And also another key consideration for this category is that it can be adapted and applied on its own for new initiatives, including pilots and new programs. And that's an important point here, and it's noted at the bottom of each of these slides, is when it would be particularly appropriate or maybe not appropriate to apply the maturity model to a given program. Obviously, planning and design can be applied to a program that is proposed, whereas some of the other capabilities may require the program or pilot to be launched, and then you can start to assess it using the maturity model. So there's a lot of different potential applications here, and we don't want to constrain it to only certain applications, because there's a lot of smart people out there who could take this information and adapt it accordingly. And yeah, we're really excited to see what comes out of it. So as mentioned, for the remaining 6 categories here, I'm not going to get into the details, but it's a similar slide that shows the focus for that category, the goal for higher levels of maturity, and considerations for adapting the category, as well as how it applies, how and when that category and all of the underlying capabilities would apply. Just jumping through here. Now let's take a look at some example applications. So when applying the demand flexibility maturity model, first off, it's important to understand that it primarily applies to retail demand flexibility programs run by utilities. And as mentioned, with involvement from third-party technology providers or device makers and DER aggregators. It could also apply to many aspects of dispatchable time-varying pricing programs, such as critical peak pricing. But it's important to note that the maturity model does not include all pricing-related capabilities, such as rate design. So there isn't any discussion of that in the maturity model. But a program like critical peak pricing, how you plan it, how you operate it, how you evaluate it, a lot of those aspects of the maturity model can be applied to a pricing program, just not the rate design elements and some other pricing specific capabilities. Secondly, in combination with other metrics, states can also use the maturity levels as indicators of demand flexibility progress as part of utility financial incentives. So we'll show a quick example of that in a moment. It's hypothetical, but we'll lay out some potential application there when it comes to performance incentive mechanisms. And third here, as I mentioned before, any utility, including municipal and utilities and cooperatives, can use the maturity model to conduct a self-evaluation. And that's how the cybersecurity maturity model are applied within the utility industry, as well as the smart grid maturity model that Carnegie Mellon developed several years ago. And so these two example maturity model applications I'll walk through in this section briefly, though as mentioned, there are many more potential applications. In our case, we're supporting a state with adapting the maturity model to develop minimum filing requirements for a utilities or that state's utilities demand response plans. And we're also incorporating the maturity model into a demand flexibility roadmap that we're developing for the states. So those are just two other examples. We're not going to get into that today, just want to give you a sense of the broad applicability of the maturity model as a whole or subsets of it. So here's a quick look at a hypothetical example of how a state could select demand flexibility maturity model capabilities to use as metrics for a utility performance incentive mechanism. So for example, consider a utility's dispatch strategy capability within the planning and design category. So the low maturity is where there's a lack of alignment with system needs, and a higher maturity is when we have this close alignment with the needs of the distribution and bulk power systems. And so in this case, the state could have a performance incentive mechanism, or PIM, associated with the demand flexibility portfolio. And that could initially focus on planning and design capabilities, given that when the portfolio is first being developed or improved upon, maybe focusing on the planning and design capabilities would be a good area to develop metrics tied to the maturity levels and have a performance incentive tied to those metrics. But as the utility achieves higher level of maturity for dispatch strategy in this case and other capabilities in the planning and design category, the metric weighting when it comes to the PIM could change to emphasize a different category. So program operations or DER orchestration may come more into play after the dispatch strategy and all the planning components are at a higher level of maturity. And that could start to look at third-party provider integration more closely. And then ultimately, outcome-based metrics are really important, but in some cases they can be a bit of hard to measure early on and understand really how the program is performing and incentivize those metrics. So that could be something considered later on in the process where you begin by focusing on metrics that are tied to the maturity levels, but then over time emphasize outcome-based performance metrics like megawatts shed or megawatts shifted and things of that nature. And then here's a second application related to using a maturity model to benchmark capabilities. So this is actually an example from California with the wildfire mitigation maturity model. And so this graph on the right is looking at the three large electric IOUs in California, and specifically looking at the vegetation management and inspections category. So like our maturity model for demand flexibility, the vegetation management and inspection categories has a bunch of underlying capabilities. And then in this case, they're able to take those scores and aggregate them and see not only how the utilities maturity level benchmarks against the other two utilities now, 2023 in this case was when this report was done, but also looking at projected levels of maturity as the utility evolves their capabilities. And so this is an interesting application here. And it can really help the utility understand how they're doing at a category level. So with the demand flexibility maturity model, that would be the 6 different categories. But then if, say a utility is scoring relatively low in a certain category relative to other utilities, you could start to really dig into the specific capabilities underneath that category and understand how the utility can improve and have that really good focus on their roadmap and in their program development of where to improve and how that can ultimately lead to a better maturity score for that category and a more effective program ultimately. So that's it for the 2 applications. And finally, we're just going to sum everything up. We've certainly thrown a lot at you today. And so want to make sure we have this summary that is, all about advancing demand flexibility, maturity in an era of surging load. There's been this widespread adoption of advanced meters, connected devices, including electric vehicles, but utilities have generally not moved beyond traditional direct load control programs. And so, especially with surging load, demand flexibility is urgently needed to mitigate capacity constraints and avoid power interruptions. So there still is this vast potential for behind the meter technology to alleviate grid constraints. And as many studies have shown, that could be done at a very low cost relative to other resources. But it's all about, the devil's in the details and how the utilities develop these programs and how states incentivize more mature and impactful programs. And so that's where we think the maturity model can really help out, given that it's based on these well-documented industry best practices and barriers to broader demand flexibility adoption. And we're just hoping that this detailed practical guidance based on these wide range of lessons learned can help states and utilities prioritize investments, identify gaps, and really drive continuous improvement, and hopefully finally realize the promise of demand flexibility and move beyond traditional direct load control programs. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Josh. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in.
All right.
I'm gonna read one to you, and I'll also put it in the chat so you can refer back to it. But you mentioned that metrics could also start to emphasize outcome-based performance tied to shedding, shifting, and shaping load.
Mhm.
Can you discuss where characteristics of programs are discussed in the maturity model that will help programs meet goals such as peak reduction, shifting, market
Mhm.
integration of DERs? And how could the matrix be modified to include these if they're not already included?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And actually, there's a resource I believe I put in here. No, maybe not. It's in the report. It was a great. Oh no, yeah, here. So this when it comes to like thinking about metrics, right? This is a really great report by Nayruck, because there's the performance metrics, right, which are the ultimate outcome you're going for. But there's a lot of challenges with that over the years, because demand flexibility is hard, it's hard to measure, and so and the tracking over time can also be a challenge, and tends what I've seen to get utilities and states to just focus on that big, you know, days when there's a big load shed and focusing on that capacity or megawatts that are delivered on under those situations. And so the maturity model actually doesn't focus on performance-based metrics. It's about the capabilities that as you mature, you can start to have better outcomes and track along the way as programs evolved, making sure that they're meeting certain benchmarks from a capability perspective. And so as described in this Nayruck report, that would be kind of like an activity-based metric of, is the utility achieving certain capabilities, right? A certain level of maturity in those capabilities. And for programs that are starting out or just starting to scale up, that could probably be a better focus than the actual outcome-based performance metrics. So that's why there's a differentiation there. But to put it short, the maturity model focuses on more of those activity-based metrics of achieving certain capabilities and maturities, as opposed to the outcome metrics that have been a focus for many years, but have had various challenges that have limited progress, in my opinion.
Yeah, and maybe you can go back to slide 11 to show all of the different capabilities that are discussed in the report, because I think there's a lot of different places where metrics that or where characteristics could be discussed in this way that are identified in all of these different capabilities. Because I think when you look across at the very high level 6 categories, it seems like it would be metric driven, but when you start to look at all of these different capabilities, there's quite a bit of opportunity there.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, and also,
let's,
just to put it short, I'm also like when I'm talking about activity-based metrics or capability-based metric, it's basically saying like the maturity level is the metric, right? And then you roll it up across all of these, and then you get an overall metric. But yeah, as part of that, it's not going to give you that like what is the megawatt number, right? But it's a good way to track progress and compare utilities, and then ultimately lead to those better outcomes that we're all hoping for.
right. So another question that came in, since you recently introduced this matrix, I'm assuming there aren't any public utility commissions or utilities that have used it yet. You mentioned that your work builds on other maturity models such as wildfire mitigation. Can you speak about how those maturity models have driven change, or if you have seen utilities evolve because of those maturity matrices?
Yeah, so I would say this maturity model doesn't necessarily specifically build off of like the best practices or capabilities that are in the other maturity models. What it does, though, is it takes the concept of a maturity model, which in the case of wildfire mitigation in California has been applied in a regulatory context, as I showed in the example, to benchmark utilities. And that's been quite effective at really helping utilities in California compare best practices, surface new best practices because they're constantly updating the maturity model. And so I would say in that case, it's hard to say for sure of all the things that California has done with wildfire mitigation that the maturity model was the one thing that made a huge difference, but certainly the overall initiative has been, quite effective with reducing the number of catastrophic wildfires, especially, when you look at what happened back in 2017 and 2018. But yeah, the cybersecurity maturity model, there was a large number of utilities that contributed to it, as it shows at that link. I'm not a cybersecurity expert myself, but and then also, so I wouldn't know like what were the specific outcomes of that. And then the 2018 Carnegie Mellon maturity model, it was very helpful, and there's presentations that are still out there that talk about trends and benchmarking utilities and like what types of capabilities utilities should focus on that informed a lot of smart grid investment strategy and prioritization. And so I think there has been a significant effect there. But basically what we did is we took the maturity model concept that was inspired by these 3 examples and built our own maturity model within that general framework based on industry best practices when it comes to demand flexibility programs. So there hasn't been anything similar for demand flexibility specifically. And so this would be the first time it's being done for demand flexibility. And we are working with a state to apply it to minimum filing requirements for DR plans, as well as developing an overall demand flexibility roadmap. So yeah, we're excited to see how it shakes out.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue to one of the next questions, which is about how can the maturity matrix help utilities actually mature their programs as opposed to just measure how mature they are. So how can utilities use this to evolve their programs? And I think you started to touch on that when you were talking about working with a state.
Yeah, and so I think if you look at the regulatory process in many cases, there is kind of this idea of a maturity model that's implicitly um, part of it, right? It's taking a look at what is the current state of a programs in a given jurisdiction and where you want to go, right? And so a big issue that I've seen in the industry over the years in evaluating dozens of programs and pilots, many of which have not been super cost effective or successful in many cases, like the California demand response auction mechanism, is that yeah, there's this kind of wanting to jump to like, oh, show me the megawatts, right? But especially early on, if there's a new need for these resources and a need to be able to track things along the way and have those key leading indicators that are identified, um, that is yeah, just like a really important part of the process, as opposed to just focusing on your outcome-based metrics and telling the utility, like, hey, come back to me in 3 years and show me your megawatt numbers. That has not worked in the industry, I would say. I don't know, Natalie, if you would disagree with me, but the idea is to kind of use this maturity model to make it more explicit of like, hey, we want to know where you are, we want to know where you're going, and we're confident that if you do improve in maturity, that the outcomes will be better down the line. And that's not to say you'll never focus on those ultimate outcomes at scale, but the tracking of maturity along the way can be really helpful. But yeah, Natalie, I would appreciate it if you wanted to add anything to that.
I think that similar to what you're saying about how regulators can drive this, utilities can also um, look at where they want to go and chart a path forward and show the investments that they would like to make to advance demand flexibility to their regulators and say, this is the reason, to help support why they might want to change different aspects of their programs or make investments in ways that they, were different than what they've done in the past. And so, it can help the utilities identify maybe what some of their pain points are or how to show what their vision is and why the investments are needed along the way. So I think it is an opportunity for both regulators and utilities to use this.
Yeah, and I'd say another thing too that just came to mind was, especially learning from the experience in California, the data infrastructure part of it is often overlooked, can be expensive. So maybe that's the reason why people just don't really want to talk about it or look at those numbers. But these are basically just laying out like what's required to ensure that you deliver an impactful demand flexibility program at scale. And I see it time and time again with these plans that are laid out where they talk about program by program what the plan is, completely ignoring the underlying data infrastructure, in some cases ignoring the DR orchestration that's going to be required. And then you might end up with a program that's very manual, where the orchestration is done by sending around Excel spreadsheets, which is prone to human error, and it's not going to be able to enable dynamic flexibility on the system. And then if you don't have the data infrastructure in place, in the end, there might be very little transparency and the ability to really understand what happened and be able to even measure those really important outcome-based metrics. And so you could also kind of think of it as like, what is the prerequisites for delivering an impactful program at scale, and then kind of measuring the maturity as utilities improve in those different capability areas.
Great. So we had another question come in that is around the randomized groups.
Hmm.
And this person was asking, I think it was specific to the example that you walked through around customer engagement. How would um, how would you create your randomized groups if you were looking at a commercial and industrial program? And if you can't do that, do you have any ideas of what kind of modifications could be made?
Yeah, that's a great question because it also highlights the kind of generalized approach we're taking here. Because there is also the challenge of making sure that this isn't too like residential program focused versus commercial and industrial. Um, uh, Given that we're really looking at driving programs at scale with this maturity model, it does kind of lean more in the direction of mass market programs. And so, yeah, the randomized groups here is just something that's really important and often overlooked. There's more detail in the report about it. It's actually been applied in the utilities industry for many years. Um, because when you have a demand flexibility program with a large number of participants and large number of devices, you can randomize that dispatch, you can randomize the recruitment, and really get some strong causal inference type information to know like, oh, wow, this targeting approach really works, or this message really works, or this is exactly what you can expect when a given AC cycling strategy is called. And so that term is used quite a bit at this level 5, because when you have these more mass market programs, honestly, not doing some sort of randomization across the board is a huge missed opportunity, because when you have a fairly large number of customers and you can randomize messaging, you can randomize marketing, you can randomize dispatch strategies. There's just so much valuable information that can be had, and this is a level 5 practice here that we're integrating into that level quite a bit, and it is based on utilities that have done that type of approach with their marketing or their dispatch and evaluation of programs. But yeah, unfortunately, if it is like a mass market program where there's only 20 CNI customers and they're all very different in size, you could randomize the groups, but it's not going to give you as good information because there's smaller groups. You need, at least, a couple hundred in your treatment group and control group to really get value out of it. And so I would say in that case, for that type of program, you're just not going to be able to achieve this level, which again is fine. It's not, as I mentioned before, you're not necessarily meant to always achieve that higher level of maturity. And so in that case, you just wouldn't, shoot for a level 5 maturity with a CNI program. There's probably a few cases of that throughout the maturity model where for a smaller CNI program where every customer is very different, that you wouldn't be able to achieve that level 5 level of maturity.
All right, we have one last question, and it's about how microgrids fit into
Mm.
progressing the maturity model. But I think it could also be generalized as, technology specific. How are different technologies fitting into the maturity model? So you can answer either one.
Yeah, so I think microgrids, if that is a grid need, the ability to support a microgrid, that is something that is captured in the higher levels of maturity when it comes to the dispatch strategy or the planning to be able to achieve that higher level of uh, maturity with your flexibility of the program is you're not just calling it on peak, you're calling it to meet local needs. And one of those local needs could be microgrids. We don't talk specifically about microgrids in this case, but that is kind of like the next level beyond distribution system benefits, but like even smaller sets of the distribution system, the ability to support a microgrid and be flexible in that scenario could be really valuable. But I think the industry is pretty far away from that at this point when it comes to microgrids, which typically have, like a large battery or diesel generator to power the microgrid from what I've seen throughout the country.
Great, thank you, Josh. I
We
think
have a
that
hand raised, actually.
I don't think that we can unmute people right now,
Ah, okay.
but
Well,
Josh's slides will be available on the website. Feel free to reach out to either of us for additional information. Those are our emails. We can have additional dialogue that's not through this particular platform. Good. We got a thumbs up. Okay.
all right.
So yeah, please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you everyone so much for attending the webinar. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.